June 7, 1944. 0417 hours. Southern approach to Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, Normandy. Damp morning cold settled across the hedgerow line as scattered Allied infantry groups crouched low behind broken stone walls and water-filled ditches. The first light of dawn revealed the outline of a tall German observation tower that rose above the fields like a rigid spike. German artillery had used that tower for more than 24 hours. Every Allied attempt to push through the village met precise fire within minutes. Shells landed with mechanical accuracy. Mortar crews tried to counter but could not match the speed of German corrections. The advance stalled and casualties grew. Command reports described the tower as a minor structure. The men on the ground disagreed. It controlled a crossroads, a water pump station, and 2 farm lanes that fed the armored route toward the causeway. Nothing moved in that sector without the tower crew seeing it. Sergeant Elias Thorne pressed his shoulder against the mud brick wall of a collapsed barn and studied the tower through field glasses. He was 38 years old and one of the older NCOs in his battalion. His men often noted his calm routine under pressure. He looked at terrain the same way he once looked at construction frames. He inspected angles, load points, joints, and the way weight shifted from wind or soil. Before the war, he built cabinets, barns, and staircases. Clients trusted him because his work never sagged or cracked. He solved problems with simple machines. Hinges, pulleys, sliding beams. He preferred efficient solutions over force. A mortar blast shook the ground. The concussion snapped branches overhead and showered the squad with leaves. Thorne lowered the glasses. Another stretcher team rushed past behind him carrying a wounded radioman whose leg was torn below the knee. This was the 7th casualty from the tower in 2 hours. The position had to be neutralized soon or the entire push on the southern road would fail. Thorne moved closer to Lieutenant Hale, who knelt behind a splintered wagon frame, marking a map with a blunt pencil. Hale's hands shook from stress and cold. The lieutenant explained the situation again. Direct fire weapons could not reach the tower without exposing the gun crews. Bazooka teams had tried to push forward through a drainage ditch but were spotted and hit instantly. Artillery was inaccurate due to fog banks and uneven wind. Air support had been diverted. Engineers attempted to bring forward a standard ladder but it was too short. A second team tried to lash 2 ladders together but the combined structure flexed under weight and snapped near the midpoint. Hale's voice sounded strained. Standard doctrine provided no clean solution. Thorne listened quietly. His eyes drifted back to the tower. The structure was more modern than expected. German carpenters used reinforced timber beams, metal braces and poured concrete footings. The lower entrance was protected behind a steel-plated door with firing slits. The only access point that seemed vulnerable sat 23 feet above ground, shielded from the northern and western sides but partially exposed on the southern face. The Germans did not expect an approach from that direction due to mud pits and lack of cover. They believed the angle impossible to climb. Thorne considered the measurements. He counted the vertical joints. He examined the spacing between planks. He noticed a narrow shadow line where the concrete base transitioned to wooden frame. His mind compared it to a barn loft that needed extension access. He turned back to the wrecked barn behind them. Several interior doors lay smashed among the debris. Their hinges remained usable. Thick iron plates with pin barrels wide enough to hold weight. He picked one up and rotated it. The hinge moved smoothly. Years of carpentry filled his thoughts. He remembered building a collapsible attic ladder for a farmhouse near Logan, Ohio. He designed it to fold outward in segments. Each segment locked as the next extended. No single beam carried the entire load. Weight distributed across multiple joints. He looked again at the barn doors. He looked at the salvaged timber. Then he looked at the tower. A plan formed with sharp clarity. Thorne approached Hale. He spoke plainly and without dramatic tone because he was exhausted. He requested permission to salvage wood, metal straps and hinges from damaged buildings to construct a folding ladder built in 4 linked sections. Each section would be short enough to carry without attracting fire. Each set of hinges would allow the structure to extend vertically once placed at the correct angle. Thorne explained that the southern face of the tower had no active sentry window positioned to see men approach at ground level until they were already climbing. The fog provided additional concealment. He estimated construction time at 3 hours if he had uninterrupted access to materials. Hale stared at him. The idea sounded reckless. Yet every other method had failed. Command demanded progress. The lieutenant approved the plan with a tired nod and told Thorne to gather 3 men for assistance. The squad shifted emotional weight. A new possibility cut through the despair. Thorne and his makeshift team moved quickly through collapsed farm structures. They collected planks with minimal warping and cut them into uniform lengths. They removed hinges from shattered doors and hammered them flat against stones. They reinforced hinge plates with metal straps taken from a ruined horse stall. They used roofing nails and a small number of screws pried from cabinet frames. Thorne measured each segment repeatedly. He checked grain direction to avoid splitting under load. He cut shallow recesses so each hinge sat flush, reducing noise during extension. He worked with the focus of a craftsman who had never left his trade. By 07:30 hours the skeleton of the ladder lay across the barn floor. 4 segments, each roughly 6 feet long. Hinges positioned to fold inward for transport and outward for locking. Total reach stood at 24 feet, which exceeded the height needed to grasp the tower's mid-rail. Weight distribution felt balanced. Thorne lifted the first segment. Held firm. He called his team together. They rehearsed the extension process. 2 men would carry the folded structure across the southern field. 1 man would provide covering fire if discovered. Thorne would secure the base against the concrete footing, then climb first to test stability. They practiced twice in the barn. Each movement required silence and precision. No wasted sound. No unnecessary motion. Outside, artillery roared again. A shell landed 200 meters north, sending a plume of soil into the air. The men froze until fragments stopped falling. Thorne looked through the barn door toward the tower. German observers remained active. Allied commanders grew impatient. The ladder had to move soon. Thorne checked every hinge one final time. He tightened 1 screw. He sanded an edge with a stone fragment so it would not scrape during ascent. He knelt beside the structure with his hands resting on the timber. His breathing slowed. The next hour would decide whether this plan was remembered as a smart risk or a fatal mistake. He rose and gave the signal to move. Thorne and his 3-man team stepped out from the husk of the barn and entered the narrow field that led to the southern base of the German watchtower. The men moved slowly to minimize noise. Fog still clung to the low ground. Patches of darker mist swirled around broken fence posts and crater lips. The folded ladder rested across the shoulders of Private Merrick and Private Alton. Each carried the weight with steady, practiced balance. Corporal Red followed several paces behind with rifle raised. Thorne led at the front, guiding the route by memory and careful observation. The southern approach was a strange mix of swampy puddles and elevated strips of dry soil. During the previous day, rain had filled shallow drainage ruts until they overflowed. German spotters dismissed this route because vehicles could not pass through it. They assumed no infantry would risk slogging across open mud toward a defended tower. They did not consider that a carpenter would see the same terrain as workable cover because uneven ground distorted sight lines. The team paused near a fallen oak trunk. Thorne raised his fist. All movement stopped. A faint metallic click echoed from the tower platform. 1 sentry shifted his MG-42 on its pivot. The weapon angle changed to the northern hedgerows. The crew expected attacks from the main road, not the flooded fields. The tower continued scanning away from the carpenters who crept through the southern mist. Thorne looked over the field again. He mapped the distance. 60 meters to the base. The fog provided concealment but not invisibility. Any sudden change in wind could expose them. He signaled the others to continue. The folded ladder bumped slightly against Alton's back. Thorne stopped again and adjusted the hinge straps with quick fingers. Any noise could betray their presence. Alton nodded. They continued forward, stepping on dry patches and avoiding water where possible. The mud would suction their boots and create sound. At 30 meters out, the shadow of the tower grew sharper. The men could see the outline of the lower steel door. No movement appeared at ground level. Thorne knew that the Germans assumed no one could climb the southern side because it lacked handholds. They built it that way intentionally. It was a blank wall of timber rising above a concrete footing. It offered no purchase for ropes or grapples. Thorne whispered orders. Merrick and Alton knelt. They lowered the folded sections with controlled movements. Thorne knelt beside them and placed his hand on the timber. The hinge pins were cold. He eased the first segment open with slow pressure. The ladder extended without sound. The second segment locked. The third opened with a soft creak. Thorne winced. The creak was small, but any noise near a guard post carried risk. He pressed the hinge, reducing friction, and opened the final segment. The full length of the ladder lay in front of them like a long timber spine. Red scanned the tower, ready for sudden fire. Nothing moved. Thorne lifted the ladder with Merrick's help. They carried it upright. The base sank slightly into the softened soil. Thorn shifted angle until the upper edge aligned with the midpoint of the tower's southern rail. He tested the ground with his boot heel. Stability was acceptable. The load would distribute evenly across all 4 segments if weight remained centered. The tower loomed overhead. Morning light brightened behind it, creating a faint silhouette of the top platform. A German voice drifted down. Someone spoke about wind direction. Another answered with a comment about artillery spotting reports. None of them looked down. Thorn wrapped his fingers around the first rung. The wood felt solid. He breathed through his nose and began climbing. Each step produced slight compression against the hinge joints. The structure held. Red watched for any change in sentry behavior. Merrick and Alton steadied the base. 6 rungs up, Thorn paused. The ladder leaned against the tower with enough friction to prevent slippage. He listened. No alarm. He continued the ascent. His boots touched each rung with careful, even pressure. He imagined the structure as an interior attic ladder at home. Same physics. Same weight flow. Different consequences. When he reached the top segment, he extended one hand and found the underside of the tower's mid-rail. His fingers closed around it. The wood felt coarse. He pulled his torso level with the rail. Still no reaction from above. The fog kept him hidden from the northern and western views. The southern face remained unobserved. He swung one leg over the rail and settled on the narrow cross plank. His heartbeat slowed. He lifted the ladder slightly and wedged it securely. Now Merrick would climb next. Thorn signaled with 2 short taps against the rail. Below, Merrick moved. He climbed faster than Thorn but still controlled. Thorn extended a hand and pulled him onto the plank. Alton followed. Red remained at the base until the final moment. 3 men now crouched on the mid-level support that wrapped around the tower. They pressed against the wall to stay out of sight. Thorn felt the vibration of heavy footsteps above. German boots walked across the platform. The sentry paced with steady rhythm. Thorn pointed toward the narrow gap between planks. The tower wall had a small utility seam where 2 panels met. Just wide enough for sound to leak through. They listened. 2 voices. One adjusting binoculars. One manning the MG-42. A third voice entered briefly, likely an officer delivering correction data. Thorn drew his sidearm. Merrick prepared a grenade. Alton steadied his rifle. Thorn instructed them to wait until Red reached the mid-level. Moments later, Red climbed into view and pulled himself over the rail. 4 men now balanced along a strip of timber no wider than a barn beam. Thorn moved toward the ladder top. He pulled it up slowly, section by section, folding it toward them. He would need it one more time. The top platform rail stood 8 feet above their current position. Without the ladder, no one could reach the platform without exposing themselves to the sentry. Thorn reversed the hinge sequence silently. The ladder folded into a compact bundle again. He pointed upward. The attack would be sudden. They needed to breach before the Germans could react. Thorn angled the folded ladder, lifted it high, and placed the base on the mid-rail. He extended the segments with careful control until the top rested against the upper platform. Merrick and Alton held the base steady. Red covered the movement with rifle ready. Thorn climbed again. When he reached the platform edge, he paused. German voices spoke only a few feet away. One man laughed at something muttered by the MG-42 gunner. Thorn inhaled, shifted weight and swung onto the platform. He rose into a low stance. The nearest German saw a silhouette but did not react fast enough. Thorn struck first. Thorn's boot met the German sentry's rifle stock with a sharp crack that knocked the weapon sideways. The startled gunner stumbled back, trying to bring the MG-42 to bear. Thorn closed the distance before the man could recover. He drove his forearm across the German's throat, forcing him against the tower railing. The gunner's heel slipped on the wet planks. Thorn seized the man's collar and pulled him down with controlled force. The struggle lasted barely 2 seconds. The German collapsed in a heap. Thorn ensured he did not rise again. The second sentry turned from the spotting scope at the sound of impact. His hand darted to the sidearm at his belt. Thorn reached the man before the pistol cleared its holster. He grabbed the wrist, twisted, and forced the weapon to the floor. Merrick climbed onto the platform at that moment. He fired a single shot that dropped the second sentry instantly. The platform fell silent except for the wind moving across the wooden beams. Red and Alton joined them. They spread out to check all corners. Thorn signaled for caution. There was still a possibility of a third observer or a secondary crew member. They searched the narrow storage recess under the platform roof. No movement. No hidden soldiers. The tower was now in Allied hands. Thorn approached the MG-42 mount. Its field of fire covered the entire road network that fed into Sainte Marie du Montana. The gun had inflicted more than 30 casualties since the previous night. He examined the sight settings. He noted the elevation marks. He saw handwritten grease pencil corrections on the mount where the Germans had tracked Allied movement. Every shot from this tower had been calculated with precision. Red took position at the platform edge and scanned the village rooftops. Allied infantry still awaited the signal to advance. They did not know the tower had fallen. Thorn's team had succeeded without firing more than a handful of rounds and without alerting the broader German line. Below, the fog thinned. Sunlight broke through in scattered rays. The southern fields brightened. Thorn told Merrick to prepare a flare. Command needed confirmation. Merrick readied the signal but waited for Thorn's cue. Thorn inspected the stair shaft inside the tower that led to the ground-level door. The interior was narrow and steep. He listened. No sound rose from below. It was possible that the ground crew had retreated when the sentries fell, but he could not assume it. He signaled Red to cover the opening. Red steadied his rifle and watched for movement. There was none. Thorn turned to Merrick. He gave the order. Merrick fired the green flare high above the platform. The smoke trail arced across the morning sky. Allied riflemen in the hedgerows spotted the signal. They cheered. Officers called for renewed movement. The stalled advance began to tighten formation again. The road toward the crossroads would soon reopen. Alton stepped beside Thorn and looked across the village. German mortar fire had decreased. The observers no longer fed coordinates to the batteries. Confusion spread among enemy positions. A sudden drop in accuracy indicated the loss of their primary spotting post. Allied units could now maneuver with far less risk. Thorn glanced at the ladder still leaning against the platform rail. His improvised structure had carried 4 men to this point. No segments had cracked. No hinges had failed. A civilian design concept, created under pressure, had solved what direct fire, artillery, and doctrine could not. He moved to the far side of the platform and observed the defensive layout. The Germans built the tower on a concrete block with reinforced joints. They believed the structure unapproachable. They assumed height and clear lines of sight would prevent any flanking maneuver. They relied on elevation as their strongest defense. They never considered a carpenter who understood how to defeat height with modular reach. Red called out from the stairwell. He heard faint voices below. Thorn approached. The voices grew louder. 2 Germans debated whether to attempt escape or remain inside the tower base. They had remained silent until now out of fear that Allied fire would reach them. Thorn considered a quick breach but halted when the voices shifted into frantic whispers. Something clanged against the metal door. A moment later, footsteps retreated deeper into the structure. Thorn and Red exchanged glances. The Germans were barricading themselves inside. The team had no need to force entry. Their objective was already complete. The tower was neutralized. The observers were either captured or cornered. The threat had ended. Thorn instructed the team to maintain platform control until relief forces arrived. Alton knelt near the MG-42 and inspected the ammunition belts. Hundreds of rounds remained. The Germans prepared for a long defense. They did not expect a silent vertical assault. They prepared for frontal infantry charges that they could suppress with sustained fire. They trusted doctrinal assumptions that did not hold against field ingenuity. Thorn returned to the platform edge and signaled toward the southern hedgerow. A group of Allied engineers advanced across the fields, moving quickly now that artillery fire had slowed. They reached the base of the tower and paused at the concrete wall. Thorn instructed Merrick to drop a rope. The engineers tied their packs and equipment, then climbed one by one. More infantry followed. Within minutes, the platform held nearly a dozen Allied soldiers securing the area and preparing to clear the lower interior safely. Thorn stepped aside as Lieutenant Hale climbed up with assistance. The lieutenant looked at the platform, the fallen sentries, and the improvised ladder. His expression shifted from disbelief to relief. He placed a hand on Thorn's shoulder and told him that the breakthrough at Sainte Marie du Mont now depended on follow-through rather than survival. Thorn nodded. He did not smile. Men had died in large numbers because of the tower. Many would live today because the tower finally fell. The weight of that reality settled across him. He looked at the horizon. More smoke rose from the northern blocks of the village where German resistance remained strong. The tower had been only one of several obstacles. Yet it had been the most precise and punishing one. Now the path forward opened. Engineers began reinforcing the platform. Hale instructed them to prepare the tower for possible Allied use. The MG-42 mount could support an Allied machine gun. The height advantage could now shift to their side. Thorn helped them secure tools. He explained the construction pattern of the tower, pointing out stress points and safe load areas. His carpentry knowledge guided every recommendation. As they worked, German mortar shells detonated farther east. The enemy line adjusted blindly. Without the tower, their coordination weakened. Reports from the battalion level confirmed that the entire sector saw reduced fire accuracy. Thorn remained focused. He wanted to see the tower fully controlled before stepping away. By 08:35 hours the tower platform was secure. Allied marksmen replaced the German observers and adjusted their scopes toward the northern outskirts. The battalion commander issued rapid orders to advance infantry companies through the open lanes. The sound of small arms fire spread through the village as the main assault resumed. Thorn leaned against the inner rail, examining the structural joints where the platform met the support beams. The tower had held its ground against shell shock for more than a day. The craftsmanship was strong. He respected that. He also noted weaknesses that Allied engineers needed to know. Red approached him with a canteen. Thorn accepted it with a tired nod. His hands shook slightly from exertion. Despite the success, he remained alert. War never gave clean endings. Other threats often appeared while soldiers celebrated too early. Below, 2 engineers used controlled charges to break through the steel-plated lower entrance. They wanted the Germans inside to surrender, but they prepared for resistance. A blast echoed against the timber walls and dust drifted upward through the stairwell. Shouts followed. The engineers called for the defenders to lay down weapons. After several tense seconds, 3 Germans emerged with hands raised. Their uniforms were covered in dust. They looked defeated and confused. They expected to fight an infantry wave, not lose their position to a carpenter's ladder. Thorn watched them escorted away. Their surrender confirmed what Allied units had already sensed. The tower had been the anchor of the defensive grid. Its loss disrupted the entire German approach. Lieutenant Hale returned to the platform and motioned for Thorn to step aside. Hale wanted a full briefing. He asked how Thorn identified the southern blind angle, why he trusted the ladder's load strength, and how he knew the hinges would hold under field conditions. Thorn explained each point with precision. Years of carpentry gave him a deep understanding of stress behavior in timber. The Germans built the tower with vertical rigidity, which worked against them when confronted by a modular structure designed to climb that exact rigidity. The blind angle existed because the Germans assumed impassable mud prevented access. The hinges held because they were originally designed for door frames that carried weight through repeated motion. Hale listened with growing respect. He recorded the details. Command would want to understand how an improvised tool succeeded where trained assault teams had failed. The fog finally lifted. From the tower, Thorn could see the full expanse of St. Marie du Montana. Smoke rose from several rooftops. Columns of infantry advanced between stone walls. Tanks rumbled along the main road. He watched American troops push through the northern block where German resistance still held firm. Machine gun bursts echoed through the streets. Mortar rounds landed near the church square. The battle was far from finished, but the momentum had shifted. Thorn stepped to the opposite railing and looked back toward the barn where he had built the ladder. He remembered the scattered tools, the broken timber, and the quiet moment when he tightened the last hinge. He thought about the risks. A single hinge failure would have killed him first. A missed rung would have ended the attempt. Every movement had relied on steady hands and trust in his own craftsmanship. Merrick joined him. The young private said nothing at first. He simply looked over the village and watched the infantry push forward. After a moment, Merrick asked how Thorn learned to build folding ladders so quickly. Thorn described his work on attic access structures in Ohio. He explained how farmers requested custom designs for tight barn lofts. He explained how he always preferred solutions that avoided force when precision could solve the problem instead. Merrick listened carefully. He had not expected a civilian skill to decide the outcome of a battlefield engagement. Alton approached with an ammunition crate and set it beside the MG mount. He adjusted the weapon angle and practiced tracking imaginary targets. Thorn noticed Alton's focus and recognized the shift in morale. The men now believed they had the advantage. Hale received updated orders from battalion headquarters. He turned to Thorn and relayed the message. The tower would serve as a temporary Allied observation point until armored support reached the crossroads. Thorn's team was to remain on the platform for another hour to maintain security. After that, engineers would handle further reinforcement. Thorn accepted the order. He sat on a crate and finally allowed his muscles to relax. Sweat dried on his uniform. His fingers were raw from wood handling. He felt each bruise where his body had slammed into the platform during the initial breach. He remained quiet. Minutes passed. Allied radio chatter filled the air. Reports confirmed that mortar accuracy had dropped significantly. German counter-fire was now sporadic and unfocused. The loss of the tower crippled enemy visibility. A runner climbed the ladder and delivered fresh information. The German line near the western orchard was collapsing. Infantry companies were pushing through with minimal resistance. The southern sector advanced faster than predicted. Command attributed the progress to the elimination of the tower's spotting capability. The runner thanked Thorne's team before descending. Red leaned against the rail and looked at Thorne. He mentioned that the tower would have cost hundreds of lives if left operational. He stated the obvious. Thorne's ladder had prevented that outcome. Thorne acknowledged the point with a slight nod but said no more. Thorne stood and walked around the platform again. He inspected every beam, every bracket, and every joint that carried weight. He wanted to ensure the tower could handle additional personnel. He tapped on load-bearing posts and listened to the vibrations. The Germans used quality timber. The structure remained strong. As he reached the northern rail, a distant crack of a rifle snapped through the air. A bullet sparked off the metal mount near Thorne. A German marksman had taken a shot from a rooftop farther north. Red dropped into a firing stance and returned suppressive fire. Allied marksmen on the platform joined him. Within seconds, the hostile shooter went silent. The moment reminded everyone that the village remained contested. Thorne lifted the folded ladder that now rested near the platform corner. He examined it as if checking a finished project before delivering it to a client. The hinges remained aligned. The segments showed no cracks. The edges were scarred from enemy equipment but retained structural integrity. The tool had done its job. Hale approached again and told Thorne that engineers requested the ladder for study. They wanted to replicate the design for future assaults on elevated structures. Thorne agreed. If the concept could save more lives, it should be shared. As the hour passed, more infantry reached the tower base. The engineers planned to convert the platform into a permanent observation station for the ongoing push inland. Thorne's team prepared to descend. The battle for Sainte Marie du Mont continued, but the tower no longer stood against them. Thorne's boots touched the ground again at 0952 hours. The descent felt heavier than the climb. Adrenaline drained from his system, leaving only fatigue and a dull ache in every joint. Engineers gathered around the improvised ladder as if it were an artifact. They inspected the hinge layout, measured the rung spacing, and ran their fingers along the recessed hinge beds that prevented scraping noise. One engineer asked how Thorne ensured weight distribution during the climb. Thorne explained the principle of sectional loading and the way each hinge plate carried only partial stress. Another engineer asked how he chose the angle of placement against the tower. Thorne described the measurements he made using shadow lines and the pitch of the southern wall. The engineers took notes. They discussed replication methods with quiet excitement. Most of them had never seen a modular ladder designed in the field under combat pressure. They recognized the value immediately. Elevated fortifications, church towers, grain silos, and industrial platforms scattered across France posed similar problems. Conventional equipment was not always available. Thorne's design provided a rapid answer. Lieutenant Hale dismissed Thorne's squad for rest. They walked toward a supply truck parked beside a hedgerow. The ground trembled with distant artillery from the northern push. Thorne found a spot against a stone wall and sat down. Merrick dropped beside him. Red and Alton leaned their rifles against a tree trunk and sat on spent ammunition crates. They spoke little. The morning had drained them. Merrick eventually asked if Thorne felt proud. Thorne replied with a slow breath. He stated that pride did not fit the moment. Relief did. Many men survived because the tower stopped firing. That mattered more than personal feelings. A medic approached the group and offered water. He informed them that casualties had dropped sharply in the last hour. Several squads reached positions that had been impossible to cross earlier. The medic thanked Thorne directly, which caught him off guard. Thorne nodded, unsure how to respond. Across the field, armored vehicles moved toward the crossroads. Supply trucks followed. Radio chatter confirmed that Sainte Marie du Mont would fall fully under Allied control before midday. The German defense fragmented under pressure from multiple directions. Engineers cleared roadblocks. Infantry secured houses. Artillery shifted fire deeper inland. The road to the Utah Beach causeways opened at last. At 1030 hours, Hale summoned Thorne again. The battalion commander wanted a detailed walkthrough of the ladder design. Thorne followed Hale to a small command post set up behind a stone farmhouse. Several officers gathered around a map table. They scanned diagrams of the tower and circled the southern approach. They asked Thorne to describe the sequence of construction, the selection of materials, and the failure points he considered before using the structure. Thorne explained every step with clarity. He began with timber selection, emphasizing the need for straight grain and minimal warping. He described how he flattened and widened the hinge plates. He discussed hinge pin strength, rung spacing, and the stress points that appeared when weight shifted during ascent. He explained why a 4-segment design created stability without making the ladder too heavy. He explained why silent deployment mattered more than speed. The officers listened with full attention. One of them asked if the ladder could be shortened for urban fighting. Thorne answered yes. Another asked if the design could handle metal reinforcement for repeated use. Thorne confirmed it could, though mobility would decrease. They took more notes. The battalion commander concluded the briefing and told Thorne that his innovation would be documented and shared with other units. He also stated that men like Thorne proved the importance of civilian skills in military operations. The battlefield often rewarded those who understood structure, mechanics, and improvisation. Thorne stepped out of the command post and looked toward the tower again. The fog had vanished entirely, revealing the village roads in clear detail. Allied flags marked several captured buildings. Smoke thinned. The sound of gunfire drifted farther north, where the front pushed inland. He walked across the field where he had carried the ladder earlier. The mud had dried slightly. Boot prints formed a path back to the barn. He approached the structure and stepped inside. The interior looked exactly as he had left it, scattered with scraps of timber and bent metal. The sunlight cut through the broken roof beams and cast angled shadows on the floor. Thorne knelt beside the workstation he had created hours earlier. He touched the scorched marks where he had hammered hinge plates flat. He examined the pile of unused timber that he had rejected due to warping. He felt the grooves in the floor where he had cut rungs. Every detail reminded him how close the plan had been to failure. A small mistake in measurement or hinge alignment would have cost lives. He remained still for a long moment. Merrick entered quietly. He asked if Thorne felt satisfied now that the battle was turning in their favor. Thorne ran his thumb over a knot in one of the discarded planks before answering. He said the work was necessary, not satisfying. Satisfaction belonged to peacetime carpentry, not war. In war, a job finished simply meant survival. They stepped back outside as another group of engineers approached the barn. They wanted to inspect the remaining materials and reconstruct the building process. Thorne explained what each piece of timber had been considered for. He showed them how he shaped the recess for hinge plates. The engineers documented each step. By noon, the battalion reported that Sainte Marie du Mont was under firm Allied control. The village church now served as a temporary command point. Armored units pushed past the crossroads and advanced along the inland routes. Supply convoys moved through without fear of precision artillery strikes. The tower that once dominated the battlefield now worked for the Allies. Thorne returned to the platform one last time with Hale. They surveyed the village. The MG mount held an Allied Browning machine gun now. New observers scanned the horizon for counter-movements. Thorne listened to radio reports. All fronts in the area showed improvement. German cohesion weakened. Hale spoke quietly. He told Thorne that leadership intended to recommend him for commendation. Thorne responded that the men deserved recognition as a group. Hale agreed, though he insisted that the ladder itself would be linked to Thorne's name. Thorne looked across the rooftops. He breathed slowly. He knew the battle would continue. Normandy presented countless obstacles. Yet this one moment, this one tower, had changed an entire morning's outcome. He placed his hand on the rail and let the tension leave his shoulders. The tower stood quiet. The battlefield beyond it moved on. His ladder rested below, awaiting study. The war continued, but one impossible structure had fallen to a carpenter who understood timber more deeply than most understood tactics. As the afternoon advanced, Thorne's team received orders to rejoin their company for the next movement inland. The sector around Sainte Marie du Mont had stabilized. Engineers converted the tower into a forward observation post with sandbag reinforcement along the railings. Signal wires now ran from the platform to the command post near the church. Allied doctrine shifted quickly once the tower became an asset. Its vantage point allowed them to plot German movement across several kilometers of farmland. The same structure that once killed their men now guided their push forward. Thorne gathered his equipment and checked each piece with habitual precision. He cleaned dirt from his boots and adjusted the straps on his pack. His men prepared their own gear. Red remarked that it felt strange to leave the tower after everything they had risked to take it. Merrick agreed but added that staying attached to one position was not their responsibility. Their job was to move with the infantry and hold the next line. Alton simply tightened his helmet strap and said they would follow orders. As they walked away from the tower, Thorne slowed. He looked over his shoulder at the ladder leaning against the supply crate. The engineers had tagged it for transport. They would disassemble it soon and record each hinge placement, each spacing measurement, and each segment alignment. Thorne considered offering advice on the replication process but decided the engineers already understood enough. The tool had served its purpose. The squad moved along the village road. The air carried the smell of smoke mixed with damp earth. Thorne observed shattered windows, damaged carts, and stone walls marked by shrapnel. He counted shell impacts in the cobblestones. Each mark represented a moment of danger for someone. Many of those impacts would not have occurred if the tower had been removed earlier. War often revealed problems that existed long before anyone noticed them. Sometimes the solution required force. Sometimes the solution required skill that came from a quiet trade. They reached a staging area where other infantry squads prepared to advance. Officers organized units by platoon. Radio operators worked furiously to coordinate with artillery. A medic station sat beside a water trough. Thorne recognized several wounded men who had been evacuated from the earlier engagement. Some waved weakly at him. Word of the latter had already circulated through the companies. Soldiers whispered about it with curiosity and disbelief. A young corporal approached Thorne and asked if the story was true. Thorne confirmed it without embellishment. The corporal repeated that the latter idea had impressed everyone. Thorne responded that it was simply the best option available. Nothing more. No need for myth-making. By early afternoon, the battalion began its movement north toward Carrefour de la Madeleine. The path led through open fields and narrow lanes bordered by hedgerows. The Germans had retreated to secondary defensive points. Skirmishes erupted in scattered pockets. Mortar fire fell at irregular intervals. Yet the advance held steady. The loss of the tower had disrupted German command flow enough that the battalion progressed faster than predicted. Thorne's squad marched between a pair of hedgerows. The ground beneath them felt firmer than the mud they crossed earlier. The weather improved. Sunlight warmed their backs. Thorne kept his eyes forward but occasionally scanned the sky for artillery spotting planes. None appeared. At one point they passed a group of engineers resting beside a cart. One of them recognized Thorne and called out. He held a rough sketch of the ladder and shouted that they planned to assemble a steel-reinforced version by evening. Thorne nodded. The engineer asked whether the hinge layout should remain identical. Thorne confirmed it should. The engineer thanked him before returning to work. The march continued until mid-afternoon. The battalion halted near a grove of trees to regroup. Thorne's team rested beside a shallow ditch. Red used his helmet as a water scoop. Alton cleaned his rifle. Merrick unwrapped a field ration. Thorne leaned back against a tree trunk and allowed his eyes to close for a moment. His mind replayed the climb. Each rung, each hinge, each measured movement. He replayed the moment he swung onto the platform. He replayed the struggle with the first sentry. He replayed the quiet after the platform fell under Allied control. He opened his eyes again and looked upward. Leaves shifted in the breeze with steady rhythm. He thought about the buildings he once constructed in Ohio. He remembered clients asking for attic ladders that would last decades. He remembered sanding beams until the edges were smooth. He remembered checking joints with precise pressure to test for stability. Those skills had followed him into war. They had shaped his decisions more than military training did. As the battalion prepared to resume movement, Hale approached one final time. He informed Thorne that the company commander intended to include his ladder in the official after-action report. Hale mentioned that higher command already saw the tactical value of the design. Thorne responded that if the idea helped future operations, then it had served its purpose. Hale added that recognition might follow. Thorne did not comment. The march resumed. The battalion pressed deeper inland. Thorne walked in silence. His thoughts drifted to the men who had fallen before the tower was neutralized. He saw their faces briefly. War created moments of triumph, but those moments never erased the cost. The tower had taken too many lives before it fell. His ladder had prevented further loss, but he could not forget the men who had already paid the price. As they reached a new assembly point near a cluster of orchards, Thorne paused again. He looked across the open fields. He imagined the tower still standing. He imagined artillery still landing with precision. He imagined the advance still stalled. The contrast struck him with unexpected force. The entire battlefield had shifted because one man applied a civilian skill to a military problem. A tool built for farmhouses had become a weapon of opportunity. Thorn adjusted his pack and prepared for the next move. He felt neither pride nor relief now. Only a sense of responsibility. The war would demand more of him. His trade taught him that strong frames held under pressure only when every joint carried its share. He intended to continue carrying his. As the sun lowered, shadows lengthened across the orchard floor. The company gathered for evening orders. Thorn stood among his men. The tower lay behind them, silent and secure. The road ahead opened toward Carpenter and beyond. Normandy remained a dangerous place, but one obstacle had been removed by a carpenter who understood how to shape timber into solutions. Thorn listened to the orders. When the company advanced again, he stepped forward with steady resolve. His ladder rested elsewhere, destined for replication. His skill remained with him. The war would continue. He would meet the next challenge with the same focus he used in the barn that morning. The fields grew quiet as the company prepared to move. The tower faded from view behind a line of trees. Thorn did not look back again.